In last week's episode, we asked whether or not superhero and destruction movies give us an opportunity to confront the cost of destruction in real life. Let's see what you had to say. Okay, so first things first, we have to talk about damage control, which is the group of superheroes that exist in the Marvel universe that take care of all of the damage that is done by all of the superhero activity that takes place. So we didn't mention damage control. I actually didn't know about damage control, which is definitely an oversight on my part. Should have spoken to Scott from NerdSync and asked his opinion on the episode. But I think, for the most part, we were focused on movies, which apparently damage control is mentioned really briefly and is about to have its own TV show, but has not been addressed, and maybe will be addressed in Civil War, which is also, of course, a part of this conversation. But I think, the thing that's really interesting about damage control is that even though it answers the question of who might take care of a lot of these things, it seems, as far as I understand, the arcs of damage control that have come out so far, one of the biggest complicating factors that moves its plot forward is the question of who is going to pay for it, like where they get their money, how they are funded, the fact that they are or are not profitable, the fact that they have shareholders, the fact that there are people with controlling stakes who maybe shouldn't, Tony Stark and Wilson Fisk were the original owners, and Tony Stark was like, I don't know, working with Wilson Fisk, a little weird. So, right, at least this is how I understand it. And so I think that there is still a way to have this larger conversation about whether or not these types of movies will inspire us to ask this question of who will pay for it, and damage control doesn't stop us from asking that question. If anything, it allows other ways to ask it. So, yeah. To Pi on the subreddit, so two things before we get to the meat of your comment. First, this is an awesome use of flair. I don't know whether or not this is specifically for me on the case that we pick one of your comments, but having a piece of flair that tells me what to say is very helpful. Otherwise, I would have said _31415 _. So, yes, thank you. Also, I am actually left-handed. As for the second part of your comment, Pi, so Pi talks about the probable existence of funds and companies and philanthropists and insurance agencies that sort of address this question of the money needed to deal with renovation. And, there are things in the Marvel Universe like the Tony Stark Fund, and the Talented Moron talked about the Green Cross, which is specifically for Hulk-related damage. And I think that the interesting thing here, the way to sort of look at how this may help us ask this question about real life is, these funds, I think, exist in those universes because there are people who feel a responsibility to address these problems because of their involvement in them, right? That the Tony Stark Fund, Tony Stark is a rich entrepreneur who has a lot of resources at his control and is also directly in some way related to the destruction that happens. And so we may ask what those people are in real life. Who are those people that have that direct connection to a kind of disaster that may take place, who are then able to put their resources forward in order to help in the aftermath? And I mean, I'm sure they're out there, but they're not, millionaire philanthropist playboy geniuses or whatever Tony Stark's sort of title segment was. And so what I think we then get led towards is the answer that solving the problem is one that I think has to be systemic. It has to be a systemic solution and not necessarily a single actor or entrepreneur solution. And so that's how I see these things sort of translating over into the larger question of how does this help us think about real life? FlintTD also on the subreddit talks about the impossible cost of building something like Tokyo 3, which is from Evangelion, the city that collapses into the ground and can hide itself when, an attack is on the way. And this made me think of an awesome post that I came across while I was doing research for this episode about whether or not it would be possible for Tokyo to rebuild itself between Godzilla-related events. And the poster, if I remember correctly, the guy who wrote it said that it is essentially feasible, just very, very difficult. So we'll put a link to that in the description. It's a great read. Scruffy ain't paid enough to clean up that kind of mess. Kit Jelica talks about how trying to translate the destruction that we see in superhero or destruction movies to real life may tend to leave out a very important factor of the way destruction is dealt with when it actually happens, which is race and economic status, and the way that destruction is dealt with in places that are more like economically successful or are home to people of a higher socioeconomic status. And this was a huge part of the problems that surrounded Katrina and the reconstruction of Louisiana and places like New Orleans, that a lot of those neighborhoods and a lot of those towns that were destroyed were people who did not have resources of their own, or who were maybe seen either explicitly or not as not being worth the trouble to rebuild their lives that had got destroyed. And I think that it's fair that when trying to sort of port over these fictional disasters to real life, it is not often the case that that kind of thing is confronted. I mean, it's not often the case that that kind of thing is confronted, period, and that is a shame. Micah Drake asks the really interesting question of whether or not superhero-related destruction and actual disaster might raise the question of whether or not civilization's even worth it, man. Like, if all of these things, if you're gonna build such a dense metropolitan area that could just get destroyed in one fell swoop by a supervillain or a natural disaster, why not build something more distributed? Why not build something that is harder to just knock down so easily? And I think this is, I mean, as a sort of existential, like highly zoomed out exercise of imagination, I find this really interesting. It's almost like antinatalism, but for cities. It's like, by building a city, are you just investing in tragedy in some way? And I mean, to a certain degree, the answer is yes. But to another degree, the answer is like, well, but you get all kinds of other things. It's just, yeah, when we start getting to the Judge Dredd level, like Mega City 1, East Coast, maybe that's bad. Linus Emmer recasts this whole situation in a really interesting light that has had me thinking for a couple days. And what they say is that it might be worth not thinking about destruction as an analog for destruction, but destruction as an analog for conflict. And that what you have in superhero movies is not a way to ask questions about how destruction and ruin gets dealt with, but how and why conflict is engaged in. And I think this is really interesting, and the thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how that then turns the destruction that happens in superhero movies into like metaphysical destruction in our world. That what you see on screen, buildings falling down and cities getting ruined and destroyed, isn't then thinking about, oh, what happens if the Empire State Building falls down? It's what happens to us as a collection of people who are around infrastructure and who are around architecture when we engage in large-scale conflicts. And is it in some way a emotionally, spiritually, or metaphysically destructive thing where it's, you know, the buildings are not literally falling down, but there is something about the foundation of our operation that is, the operation of our society or something that is being threatened or is being, you know, is crumbling. And I think that this is a really interesting way to think about this. Martha E. gets really practical in a way that I love and talks about how even if we don't start with buildings falling down and things getting destroyed, there is a certain amount of just low-level damage that is to probably be expected from the presence of superheroes just generally, and makes the case for the three-point landing as a kind of pothole. That whenever a superhero makes a three-point landing, which they are wont to do, it's you just put a huge hole in the ground. And someone has to come and fix that because that's going to disrupt traffic. And that then expands to the fact that in order to just deal with all of these little things before we even get to the massive destruction is going to require a huge team of people constantly working to undo, you know, destruction that comes at the cost of stylishness, which, yep. Bruno Cesar goes a step further and says that no matter who it is that's paying for it, it is all clearly a conspiracy by the building and construction companies to maintain their real estate dynasties and to continually profit from the destruction of superheroes. And that is definitely a comic book that I would read.